welcome everyone. Apologize for a bit behind schedule, but we'll try to make it into a good 50-minute discussion with you guys. This session will first of all be recorded, so please mute yourself upon entry.
Oh, my camera's on.
And feel free to keep your camera on. You are also welcome to share questions and comments in the chat or with this directly to the speakers. And we're also letting you know that the slides and recording will be distributed after the session. So let me just get into the agenda for today. We'll have a short introduction first, introducing all the speakers and the facilitator. Then we'll do a short overview of the report findings that came out from this report, mainly the key findings. Then we'll move over to a facilitated discussion on the report itself, and then we'll welcome you eventually to come in and share your questions with the speakers you might have. You can put them in the chat or share them directly, and we'll be closing with concluding remarks. So I'm just going to give it over to Katarina, who will be facilitating this session.
Hi, everyone, and it's so good to have all of you here. Thanks for taking the time for the discussion. So my name is Katarina. I'm an engagement manager, project manager at McKinsey, based in Berlin. And I'm part of the team who's been writing the report that will sort of be the basis of our discussion. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation we're about to have. And with that, over to Mariana.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Mariana Iskander. I'm the CEO of an organization called Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. We're based in South Africa and work in Rwanda as well. And our model works very closely with government in trying to tackle youth unemployment. Stefan, I'll hand over to you.
Stefan, you might still be on mute. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Stefan Nakaya. I'm an economist. I'm now in charge of economic and finance affairs on the Prime Minister of Togo office. And I'll be very great to take part of this meeting.
Wonderful, thank you. So then let's get into what it is we are talking about. So this session basically covers a sneak peek at a report that we've been working on and that we will be officially launching in January next year. However, we will also be distributing sort of a preprint version of it next week once it's been finalized. So you have a chance to get early access. So in this report, we've collaborated as McKinsey with Catalyst 2030, but also Ashoka, Equine Green, the Skoll Foundation, and the Schwab Foundation to better understand the question of how can governments collaborate with social entrepreneurs. And to get a grip on that topic, we've spoken to a whole lot of people. We've done more than 50 interviews with experts globally, both in governments, but also in the social sector, so social entrepreneurs working with governments. Moreover, we've had an expert group that involved, again, government side and social entrepreneur side that has been very closely involved in our drafting of the report and has given weekly feedback on it. And then finally, we've collected a lot of case examples. I think in total, we've looked at more than 50 and we've included more than 35 of them in the report. So try to base this as much as possible on evidence from around the world on what's already working. Now, in our conversations, if we can go to the next page, there were basically 5 themes that emerged from our conversations on what is needed for successful collaboration between governments and social entrepreneurs. 3 of them I would think of as almost like inputs into the production of social innovation. So things that need to be there in order for social innovation to successfully happen. And then there are enablers that make the social innovation, I don't want to say better, but more impactful probably. So if we just start on the left-hand side, I'll give a brief outline of each of them and mention a little bit of like what are the examples or the potential actions that we've identified in the report. And then as you will see, there's lots more in the actual written text. So starting with open information, here we really see two big points. One being the more information entrepreneurs have on where problems lie. So the more information governments publish about statistics and numbers and data they have, the better, because that allows social entrepreneurs to better target their interventions. At the same time, social entrepreneurs can also be great allies for governments in collecting more data. So a lot of times there are challenges for governments when it comes to collecting sensitive data, say for example, around corruption. And social entrepreneurs can be wonderful partners in creating such data from communities and basically being a trusted partner for both sides, ensuring that there's no fear of repercussions, for example. Then looking at capability building. Here what we see is, again, these two sides, the governments and the social entrepreneurs, come with quite different skill sets to the table. Governments tend to emphasize technical skills and capabilities and are often very, very deep in certain expert areas, while social entrepreneurs tend to focus on collaboration skills, so co-creation, human-centered design, communication, these kinds of things. And what we found in our conversations with experts is that it'd be great to basically move both sides a little bit closer together. That would mean that governments may need to build skills in topics like systemic thinking, so recognizing and really embracing the complexity of the problems they're trying to solve, embracing collaboration and embracing co-creation, being more comfortable with letting go and involving others outside of government, while at the same time, social entrepreneurs may need to just build up on skills that allow them to collaborate with administrations, because they tend to have different ways of working. So to make that easier, there's skill building needs on both sides. And one particular recommendation that I want to highlight here is on joint trainings. So that's an example that we found quite a bit, or a wish maybe that came up quite a bit in different conversations, to bring both public servants and social entrepreneurs together in trainings, to have them interact and learn directly from each other, rather than talking about each other and learning about each other separately. So really bringing people together and make that training a joint experience. On funding models, I think this is a very large conversation that we can only touch upon here. We've actually written an entire separate report on what is needed to fund systemic social innovation and systemic change. But what we want to say here is that the current model that governments use to fund social initiatives often isn't really well aligned with initiatives that are looking to create systemic change, structural change. So funding here would need to be more long-term, and would also need to be more flexible, less project-based, to give more planning security to social entrepreneurs working on these topics, to give more flexibility, and to also allow for learning. A lot of times when projects start, we're still learning about how the problems that we're trying to address actually work. So allowing that flexibility and the learning in the design of a grant, for example, would be super helpful in making these more successful. One thing in terms of recommendations I want to point out here is on government procurement rules, including how government grants are being distributed. A lot of times there tend to be very, very specific conditions for receiving such a grant that don't necessarily align well with how social entrepreneurs are structuring their work. So you have, for example, to meet certain criteria in terms of what kind of organization are you, that may not align with the way a certain social entrepreneur has chosen to structure, although they'd be very much capable of delivering that work. So just being mindful of that issue in designing public procurement and public grant programs would already do much to alleviate that. Now, moving on to the enabling side. Unsurprisingly, one of the topics that we've written down here is collaboration. And here we do want to talk about both within sector collaboration, meaning between different government agencies, but also between different social entrepreneurs, and cross-sector collaboration, so between the public and the private and the social sector. What we found here is that everyone talks a lot about collaboration, but actually making it happen is really, really hard, because you have to identify partners to work with, and you have to bring them to the table and get them to move from talking to actually doing things. And one recommendation here that I'd like to highlight is on actively promoting and encouraging cross-sector profiles. So people who have worked both in the social and the public sector, for example, because they bring networks in both of these sectors, and they speak the language of both of these sectors and can act as translators for their colleagues on either side. And then finally, institutionalization. So institutionalization, what we mean by that is the idea of making a social innovation more permanent. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that. In the context of governments, that might mean that a government policy is changed to make a certain practice the new normal of how things are done. Or it could mean that governments take over a successful program as part of their own initiatives and make that permanent, or establish a long-term partnership with a social entrepreneur. So there are different pathways, but what we found is, first of all, that things get a lot easier when these pathways are clear. So say, for example, when civil servants have a clear menu of options in mind to make a social innovation institutionalized. The second thing we found that I want to point out here is that this gets a lot easier when there's co-creation from the start. So rather than having social entrepreneurs build their solutions, scale them to the degree possible, and then reach out to government and say, hey, we'd like to institutionalize this with you. It tends to be a lot easier because there's more design flexibility when government and social entrepreneur work together from the start. And that's something it's probably on both sides, social entrepreneurs to be willing to have these interactions early on, but also governments be willing to speak to social entrepreneurs that may not have a lot of scale yet, but might have a great idea that could be scaled. So the openness to developing things together is really important, because it tends to really accelerate the institutionalization process. With that, I'll just pause. This is an overview and just a glimpse of the insights that we found in our conversations. The report has lots more and has lots more case examples that I don't have the time to go into here because we want to hear from our panelists. But I would very much encourage you to have a look as soon as we send that over via email. So that said, we would love to hear from both of you. And maybe Mariana, do you want to go first and share a couple of your reflections?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks to Catalyst 2030 for hosting this. I had a chance to look back at the report this morning, and I think it is a worthwhile read for all the colleagues on the call when it's made available next week. I thought what I would do is just share some reflections on some of the key findings through the lens of our own experience as an organization, and then also maybe offer up challenges that we are struggling with so that we can use this hour as an opportunity to share experiences. And certainly, I would say we haven't figured it all out by any means. I think my starting reflection is, if there are so many things people can say about the year 2020, and I think we have exactly 38 days left to get to the next one. It may not look that different, but at least we will have finished this one. And I think if there's one thing that 2020 has reinforced, it is the very unique role that government plays in representing the broader interests of the society, and how much we need our governments to function well in representing the broader interests of the society. I think governments in every corner of the world are challenged with a whole host of issues, and I'm not sure anybody says they're getting it exactly right, but the work of solving and tackling the most systemic issues cannot be done without government. And certainly that has informed the work that we do on youth unemployment and the model that we have created in South Africa. The reflection in the report about social innovators and systemic social entrepreneurs serving as society's R&D lab really stuck with me as a concept. Is how do you create the platform in the space, whether it's inside your own organization or better yet in some collaborative setup with others, for real learning and development and real research and development to happen. I think the three observations I would make about the specific findings is, I think the question of data and open information is all right. My lived experience, and maybe just to give some context, so we are a youth employment accelerator. We're organized as a not-for-profit organization, but we have been co-funded by government and the private sector since the beginning, and roughly half-half, although I think as we institutionalize our model in the next few years, government will become a larger funder. We've interacted with about 600 private sector employers, about 1 million young people, and are now at the point of establishing a national system that government, through the Office of the President, as well as other government departments in the private sector, will in essence come on to, that helps link young people to what opportunities there are in the economy, whether they be formal sector jobs or entrepreneurship opportunities or community-based opportunities. And I think that that cannot be done without this concept of information sharing and open information. I think our struggle, which is I think a practical one, is that people want to make sure that they get credit for their contribution if it is a shared data system. And I think that in some sense, it is about being specific about how everybody can see themselves in the data, not so much the principle of sharing data and not so much the principle of everybody wanting to collaborate, because often saying we're happy to collaborate and then getting people to actually collaborate is a very large abyss to cross. And so this idea of how to build data protocols that in the right way allow people to see themselves in the data and have their contributions recognized is the one observation. We issue a youth employment report alongside our country's statistics agency. And I think that has been, Katerina, to your example, a way of thinking about how you can amplify, and because our data is more youth-centered, and so we're able to reflect on youth employment trends alongside the broader employment trends that are issued on a quarterly basis. And that has been, I think, a good example of trying to think about where social innovation can amplify government information sharing. The last 2 points I wanted to make is that the funding models, which is like the nut of all of this, is, I mean, the nut of this is we can all have great ideas, but people have to pay for it, and who's going to pay for it, speaks to, I think, the legal framework issue, which is if we don't create better understanding of social enterprises and contracting models, procurement models with government, I do think that that becomes difficult, and it does become an insider. Are you inside or are you outside? And if you've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, how do you build the right kind of trust? And so for me, the funding models and the legal framework actually link together and need to be explored. The report makes a reference to creating space for policy experimentation, and I just wanted to provide an example of that, because this idea of trying to create live examples that can influence a system or help change a system. So we, in our work, work with industry bodies in the formal sector to help them take on the mantle of inclusive hiring and enabling entry-level young people to find work. And through that, we're able to persuade our Department of Trade and Industry to take on an incentive that allowed foreign investors into South Africa to receive a government investment if they committed to a percentage of inclusive hiring in terms of young people. And actually the tracking and monitoring of that, I think, is making such a compelling case for that to be taken up in other sectors and in other industries. And so I certainly feel like using government to promote incentives that might change private sector behavior is an important part of the equation and should be taken into account. And then the last piece, which is where you ended, is this idea of trying to build together instead of build apart and then try to come together. Maybe just to reinforce that, we have, as I referenced, have been in a process with our government to co-create this kind of national platform in this national system. And I think if we had just built it and taken it, I don't think we would have gotten very far. And in the give and take, as I said, some of our partners feeling like if they don't get enough credit, they're not really going to be interested in participating. A lot of the realities of what collaboration actually looks like have come to light. So I'm just going to stop there because I do think we want to use the time to engage others. And I certainly would like to hear from others about their own experiences and things that we can, oh, hi, Lena, how are you? The things we can learn from others on the call who work with government or struggle with government or partner with government in their own work. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think now let's hear from Stefan and what your perspective is. And after that, let's open the questions from everyone. Feel free to already put them in the chat. Stefan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Katarina. Thank you, Mariana. Good afternoon to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I just want to apologize for my poor English, but I think I'll try to give you the right words so that we can have what can be my comments about this report. First of all, I want to congratulate your organization because the report that I have here is a very great report that will last for a long time because there is a deep analysis, there is a strong reflection that you put in the report. And as an actor of the governance, it is a report that can serve me enough on the way I can accompany the Prime Minister in his work. So thank you very much for what is in this report. So for my comment, I think there is many examples that you put together in the report, but I don't see enough examples coming from Africa. I know that is a report from the world, but I think it can be very great to see how we can try to go deeper in this report for every space, because it's not easy to make global, but I think it's very important to make specific cases for every country on the way that every country is very specific on some or other ways. Okay. So concerning the first I can say solution for improve entrepreneurial I think for collecting data is appreciate your point of view very well, and I think one of things that we can add to what you said is there is some particular way on this collecting data in some country like African country. We have too much indigenous data that we don't arrive to collect, but all the time we are building policies, and that's the consequences. There is not enough evidence-based policies. I think is something which is very important. Today we have so many policies in our countries, but we see that those policies is not correspond to the needs of people most of the time because of the thing that you point, as you don't have any many data, it is not easy to build policies that correspond to the needs of people, and I think it's very important to point that thing and see how we can try to adapt the tools of collecting data to specific people. For example, when you go to make some statistic collecting data, it's not easy for people that don't understand French. They just know the local language. What are the tools that you can develop to say what are their problems? It's not easy because most of the time there are some projects that want to quickly finish the collecting data, so the data is not correct. We avoid some part of data. So I think is something very important to point on this report and see that it's very important to have the data because before we start any enterprises and on the social innovation. For capacities, I think it is for our is something very important also, I think, because when you see the gap between when I take some for some project that we have in our country, for example, is and for country that have less capacities, it is the big problem, the major problem in every sector. For example, it's very important to see that where are the capacities? What are the capacities in our country? We don't know for all the time. And for example, you can have capacities in the country, but as you have a very big offer of capacities coming from abroad, and when these capacities is easy to access, you forget the capacity that you have in your own country. You know, I think this part of the thing is very important also. When we are talking about capacities, we have to think it global and try to see what we can develop also the capacities, the indigenous capacities, because most of the time as we know, I'm working with the government, most of the time it's urgent. You need to have quick wins. You need to have results now, so that most of the time, according to capacities, for us, it is easy to recruit consultants, to recruit experts, to do the job and finish. But the transfer of the capacities and the use of the capacities that are in our country is not always the same. So I think it's very important, as your report shows, to build capacities and share it, and share those capacities so that everybody can leverage his level. So for funding models, it's very important, and I like very much how you say you point the fact that we have to have you need to have the structural ways to structure the fund. What I'm saying during those 10 years that I work, the government is like every ministry want to build a farm. You take Ministry of Young People, they want to build a farm. A Ministry of Environment farm. A Ministry of a sea farm. So there are many farms that we want to create, but they are not connected to see what can be the strength that we can. What can be the strength? What can be the share of tools that we can mutualize, so that we can be more impact to the people that we address all those tools. I think it's very important. There is money, but we don't know all the time how to use it and be efficient on social on social facts. And according to the collaboration, is I think yes, I want to outline an example that I faced in my hometown country. You know, I used to build most of the time some projects in my hometown, like building schools, sanitary institutions. But all the time, it is for the community. We go to look for the money from the government, from association, all those things. But one day we say, okay, we have to do it by ourselves. And we use a technical that we use in church. You know, in church on Sunday, everybody wants to show to God that He's the one who wants to give what he has in for God. And I say, if you can give like this to God, how can't you give for the school that we want to build? So I deal with the preach with all the communities, church communities in my hometown, so that on the Sunday we make the church at the under the tree of the village. And during this church, we collect more than 5 million on one church to build the school, so that there is for me, I say I don't have to write any letter to any institutions. I don't call any of my colleagues of the government to tell him to give me money to build the school. I don't do anything, but just for collaborating, just for making people together to think about a very social interest, that we put together people that to outline that it's very important that everybody must be a part of the project. Everybody must come to the project somewhat, even if it is $1 that you have, it is very important for the project. And so that, but most of the time we are in a big structure, in the big actions that we want to outline. I think it's very important to outline this. For the institution, I think what there is my last pointer that I want to outline, I think is very, very important, and you can add to your report, is the leadership. Is the leadership, because the 5 points is good, but there is it's very important to have a strong leadership in the you can have a big skills social entrepreneurs in your administration, but if you don't have a strong leadership that is accessible or want to use these capacities to build or to develop this type of things, I think it's very important that we can mention the leadership at the level of the government. If it's the Prime Minister, the President of the Republic, the ministers, it's very important to give us tools that can strengthen the leadership of our government so that we can be more efficient. So there is some quick ideas that I can give on your report, and I want to thank you also for thank you again for what you have produced, and I can encourage you to continue that way, and we'll be together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Tremendously interesting. Thank you. So with that, we've already gotten a couple of questions from the audience, and one that maybe plays a little bit into what you've already raised. So I want to put that over to you first. And that's a question on, is part of the problem of collaboration between social entrepreneurs and governments, but governments think of them as traditional NGOs that do charitable work, but that you wouldn't necessarily partner with. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sorry, Katrina, are you asking us that? Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. I mean, we are in a context that doesn't really legally recognize the space in between traditional charitable nonprofit organizations and for-profit sectors, yet we have a funding model that has earned revenue from engaging with private sector companies, has government grants, and I think that the work of trying to present yourself differently in different contexts is a part of that, as well as, and again, I think the work Catalyst is doing, trying to get these issues on the table more prominently at sort of national government levels can help.
Thank you. Stefan, what's your take?
Please, can you go once again with the question? I don't get you very well, please.
Sure. So the question was, is it a problem how governments think about social entrepreneurs? Because they are an interesting mix of an NGO, someone who might also be a business, so maybe a little bit part of the private sector, part of the social sector, but wants to work with government. So that we found that that is confusing sometimes to government counterparts. And I would like to hear what you think about that.
No, for me, I think if I get very well your question, I think is the ecosystem that we build in our countries is very important to even I think every institution is working on his way because what we have to point is every organization has his own vision, his own objectives, but it's very important that once we want to build this network, we have to we don't need it to change the vision of each organization, but all the time try to find the bridge. For me, I think is what is very important. It's very important to find the bridge so that even every organization is working for his own results, for his own vision. We it's like the job I'm doing now in the on the coordination. We don't have to change the vision of people or of organization, but we have to find the bridge. What are the transversalities that we can build between institutions? And I think it's very important that every actor is very important. There is no mix up. There is not, I don't know, the government have to take in charge every question, but the important thing is to build bridge between institutions. I don't know if I have some thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the thought of bridging, and I think that comes a little bit back to having people who have worked in both parts and can act as that bridge. And with that, I would very much like to go back to our audience. And Jane, if you're comfortable, would you mind sharing your question that initiated the discussion that I see in the chat, just with everyone, so we can hear from you?
Yeah, we're a very, very small NGO, and we've now finished our work on the ground in Zambia, improving access to diarrhea medicine, specifically oral rehydration salts and zinc for children. And we worked with the Ministry of Health and UNICEF and local NGOs and the private sector. And coming ourselves from a community development background before we began this work, we found it important to feel our way as a social enterprise in creating a partnership around the vision that we wanted to achieve together. And we really did this really feeling our way. I mean, we weren't really following anybody else's lessons at that point because we couldn't find any. But that did take some funding, not a lot, but it took some funding. And we were very lucky to have some core funding given to us. And in the UK, some grant funding from Unlimited, which was to help social enterprises to explore their ideas just as they started. But it is quite hard to get that kind of funding, which would start the collaborative process. And it takes both funding, and as Brendan has been pointing out in the chat, it also takes a certain amount of knowledge of what you're doing in order to follow the right path to win the collaboration that you would like to establish and have the shared vision. So that's really my question was, how can social enterprises easily access funding, even if it's a small amount, to be able to do that initial foundation work for collaboration, and then to get the future institutionalization, which goes along with it if you're successful. So it's the funding, but it's also the skills and knowledge. And I've been pointed at a couple of useful points where I could access more information on this in the chat. And I also share our own experience. So it's kind of a question, but also kind of a good practice, sort of a good practice lesson.
Thank you for sharing that. And honestly, I would just like to hear from everyone in the room and see what your thoughts are.
Can I try?
Please.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for the question, and I think you know, all the time there is many needs but less resources. We have to all the time try to find the best équilibre to address problems. And when you are in social fact, it's not easy because it demands enough resources. Enough resources because you are dealing with people and there are many needs for people. And when you come to the institutions also, it is not easy to put them together because it takes time, it takes money, it takes resources, all those things. And what is most of the time, I think, is to try to fix up, once. I think what is very important is to fix the institution in the I don't know how can I for example, if it, you can take a law, for example, a law, a decree, something that make the things strong on the area of institutions. I think it's very important to do that first, because once you do that, you can have time to work progressively on how to bring funds, to bring resources on the environment, and to most of the time don't make it political, because for sometimes we want to use the results of social institution to make political program. If you do that, once you have another political guy, so you have to change the institutions, and you don't have a long-term results according to the institution. It's very important to try to fix the institution and try to make it with a law, for example, which is very structural, and so that with time to time and with the years, you can have the resources, you can build a very good ecosystem, so that this you can try to solve some of the problems. You cannot solve all, but I think it can be a good way to do to bring money or to bring resources to the institutions. That's what I can bring.
Thank you.
I was just going to make a small tactical suggestion, and then maybe, Brendan, if you're comfortable, to actually ask you to also weigh in, because we've been following the comments on the chat. I mean, every context is different. And of course, I don't know who your funders are and that much about your model. But the one thing that I think has worked for us is where we have commitment from government to do something, even if it's not financial funding, but it's commitment. It's about helping a funder see that they're matching a government commitment, not funding something. And I think that that has served us really well, because you're saying you are, in essence, going to government and saying, we'd like to match your commitment, whether it's time, whether it's resources, and I think what often happens is we don't really count our government contribution to our funders in a way that helps our funders see that what they're doing is matching government investment as opposed to being the funders of something. So that's just, if it's useful in your context, just a small tactical suggestion that I think has worked well for us. But if it's okay, Ketra, I was going to put Brendan on the spot, just because I think some of his comments in the chat have also just been really useful.
Sure. And I had a big question that I have to ask too, which for sure we won't have enough time to answer in these last few minutes, but I'll give a few thoughts and then ask my follow-up question, which is the main reason I joined this, is because I wanted to ask this question. So I think, well, I mean, a few things. The funding question is, for me, a very simple answer, because I have a background in a few different areas, but one of them is fundraising. And it's really about like selling the project. A lot of funders still think very much in project basis. So even if you're thinking systems and collaboration, most funders won't get it. So think of a practical project that you're going to do with those people, and that's what you sell to the funder. And the other benefit, I think, of having a practical project even if it adjusts and shifts, because eventually you're going to go with what the group wants. If you're going to use a co-creation process, it's also for people that you're involving. It creates this kind of practicality for something for them to take forward. And when I'm kind of, maybe I'm talking a little too conceptually, so I'll just kind of put a little bit of a lens. I've worked in a lot of different places, but a lot of my work over the past decade has focused in Egypt and in the agricultural sector. And we had some certain successes on a smaller level where we brought together, small businesses, we brought together local farmers, we brought together some government officials, and came up with actual projects using participatory practices. They were funded, funders loved them. For me, that process, it wasn't expensive, which is what I was trying to say in the chat. It was about finding champions. And I think one of the big lessons in the beginning, I was always like, stay away from government, because they're only disablers in contexts like Egypt. But my colleague always pushed for going to finding a way to work. And I think the one way that we found that worked was finding small champions, people who, within a certain, maybe middle, not high, not too low, but middle level of the government that really believe in what you're doing, and you build a strong relationship with them. And those can be the people that can eventually shape things if they are guided with you over, a small project before you get to systemic level. It takes 2 or 3 years of very slow building trust and community and trying out a project and showing something works. Before it starts to grow, and then it can scale rapidly. For me, the biggest question is, in a lot of context, so everything in the report that was presented in the beginning of this, I completely agree with, and I think theoretically, systemic change needs all of those things. In practice, in certain places where there's rule of law that's set in place, and where there's a lot of other factors that aren't obstructing, a lot of these things can eventually happen. But in a place like Egypt, which is also there's a lot of very similar countries across not only Africa, but since we're talking about Africa here, the government itself, while we can find little champions inside, once you get too high of a level, the government starts to actually just block programs because you're threatening their own livelihood. It is in the interest of the government for a systemic change to not happen. So for example, in the food sector, the military in Egypt controls like 60% of the economy, and they control the big food businesses. So if you eventually get to the point where you're doing kind of market transformation with all these small actors and they're actually competing in the market, the government can just step in and say, you know what, we're just going to take your products and sell them ourselves, and that's it. So my big question that I wanted to bring to this was also, how do you create systemic change? Without kind of creating a movement, but even in a context like Egypt, obviously the Arab Spring also failed in many respects. So how do you create a systemic change and kind of change institutions and even create spaces for open data transparency in a place where the government is active interest is to work against anything that you want to achieve? I don't know if anyone can answer that. I don't know if there is an answer.
The only answer I can give is you have to take a very long view on systemic change. And I think for a lot of our work, it's like, what can be done in a generation? Forget like 2 years or 5 years or all these crazy kind of funder timelines. And I do think that trying to figure out what are the steps now for things that may take a generation or 2 or 3, which I know that that's not a satisfying answer. But I think certainly in our work, I've tried to be much more pragmatic. What can we do in the next 5 or 10 years for something that is so systemic and so broken and so overwhelming that we have to get our stakeholders, I think, to try to take a generational view. So, I know that may not be very satisfying, but I think that these are the communities where we can sustain ourselves, honestly, to keep at it when it does feel so difficult in the work, and trying to take a long view, particularly where government regimes may have to change in order for some of the work that we do to progress.
Um, yes, I can. I can try to bring some thoughts about what's about the question. I think for me there are many levels on where we can impose the systemic change. I think if I take my country for example, to bring, I think it is the mentality. We have to change the way people are thinking. It's not easy. It takes time, but we can do it progressively and according to the specific people that we face. I think, for example, when you take, I think the education in the education system, I think there are many things that we can do there so that we can bring on to change the way we teach our children and to build this trust between them that they can do things together. They can because of course in some culture, and I'm agree with Brendan to say that every country is specific and depend on how things are. But you have I'm sure that once we change the way we educate people, because all we are now is how they educate us. So it's very important to change things on the education, the system of the education. And once we arrive to put this type of reflection or this type of having, so it impels the changement or the changes that we are looking for. It is for the education system, but at the level of institutions, I think it's not easy, because even for some changes here in our country, it's not easy because there are people that are doing the thing since 30 years, 40 years. You come, you tell them that now it is not like this, you have to change, it is not, they say, oh, you come, well, what is your age, what do you want to learn to us? It is since a long time, it is like this, we are doing things. So you have to change, I think, leaders. That's why I was once in my first talk, the leadership. I think we need to find this leader that people can hear, that people can make trust, that people can invest in what he's saying. It is very important to identify those people, and you train them, you give them the capacities that can bring this trust between people, and progressively you can bring these systemic changes in the environment. I think it's what I can point on the questions, and I hope that it helped the people that have this type of. Thank you.
Thanks so very much, Stefan. I saw lots of nodding in my screen here from a lot of different people. So I think that resonated very much. Thanks for sharing. I want to be mindful of your time, so trying to wrap up, but maybe one final thought that I want to throw into Brendan's point is on, yes, change does take a long time. But I think one element of the equation that we might want to think about a bit more are the multilateral and the bilateral organizations that are providing assistance to some of these governments and their understanding of systemic initiatives. So that's something that we've briefly touched upon in the report on. It tends to work better when funders also on that side have a certain understanding of systemic change. And that might be sort of a complementary lens, but not saying that that would fix things faster, just saying they might be another actor that needs to be on the boat. That said, I think this conversation could continue for another hour. I've certainly enjoyed it very much. I want to say a big thank you to Stefan, to Mariana, and to all of you for the questions and the participation. We do hope to continue this. So Kat, if you're interested in being a part of this, in touch with Catalyst, there will be more opportunities to collaborate and co-create and discuss. And we will be in touch with a preprint version of the report as soon as we're done with it. So thanks a ton.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.